Welcome to DCF Investigations. There are moments in history when the fabric of a community is torn so violently that it never truly heals. There are crimes so heinous, so shrouded in mystery and shadow, that they transcend the era in which they occurred and become the stuff of permanent nightmare. We are traveling back to a time when doors were left unlocked, when neighbors knew every detail of each other's lives, and when the darkness of a summer night held a terror that no one in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, could have ever imagined. This is the story of a house that still stands at the end of a quiet street, a silent monument to a massacre that claimed 8 lives in a single night. This is the comprehensive, exhaustive account of the Villisca Axe Murders. To truly understand the horror that visited Villisca, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of 1912. Villisca was not a desolate backwater. It was a thriving, booming community in Montgomery County. The name itself, derived from Native American linguistic roots, meant pretty place or pleasant view. And for the 2,500 residents living there, it lived up to that name. The economy was robust, fueled by the rich, fertile farmland that surrounded the town and the bustling railroad that connected it to the wider world. It was a town of banks, opera houses, churches, and modern amenities. It was a place where the American dream felt tangible, where hard work resulted in prosperity, and where safety was taken for granted. At the center of this prosperity was the Moore family. Josiah B. Moore was one of the town's most prominent citizens. At 43 years old, he was a man of significant standing. He had built a successful business selling farm implements and machinery, a vital trade in an agricultural hub. He was known as a hard worker, a man who had started with very little and built a comfortable life for his family. His wife, Sarah Moore, was 39 years old, a woman deeply embedded in the social and religious life of the community. She was a dedicated member of the Presbyterian Church, known for her kindness and her devotion to her children. And it is the children who make this story so particularly devastating. The Moores had 4 children of their own. There was Herman, the eldest, at 11 years old. Catherine was 10, a bright young girl. Boyd was 7, and the youngest, little Paul, was just 5 years old. They were a quintessential American family, living in a modest, white frame house on East 2nd Street. On the night of the murders, the house was even fuller than usual. 2 young guests had joined the Moore children for a sleepover. Lena Stillinger, aged 12, and her sister Ina, aged 8, were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger. They had come into town from their family farm to attend the Children's Day services at the church. Sunday, June 9th, 1912, began as a day of celebration. It was Children's Day, a major event in the social calendar of the church. The atmosphere in Villisca was festive. The weather was heavy, a dampness hanging in the air that promised summer storms. But inside the Presbyterian Church, spirits were high. Sarah Moore had coordinated the exercises for the day. The children recited scriptures, sang hymns, and participated in the pageantry of the service. It was a day of innocence, a celebration of youth and faith. The service ended late in the evening, around 9:30. As the congregation spilled out into the cool night air, the Moore family and the Stillinger girls began their walk home. It was a short walk, just a few blocks from the church to the Moore residence. Witnesses would later recall seeing them walking under the street lamps, a happy group, chatting and laughing. They arrived home shortly before 10 o'clock. The routine was normal. There was likely a light snack, perhaps cookies and milk, before the family settled down. The house was locked up, a precaution that Josiah Moore was known to take, though many in the town did not bother. By midnight, the house on East 2nd Street was silent. The curtains were drawn. The family and their guests slept, unaware that someone, or perhaps someone's, had been watching. The exact timeline of what happened next is a reconstruction of horror. Sometime after midnight, the killer entered the home. Theories suggest the intruder may have been hiding in the coal shed, or perhaps had even slipped into the house earlier and hidden in a closet, waiting for the family to fall asleep. The weapon of choice was an axe, belonging to Josiah Moore himself, which had been found in the coal shed. The killer moved with terrifying precision. The master bedroom downstairs was the first target. Josiah and Sarah lay in their bed. The killer raised the axe and struck. Josiah was hit with the blade of the axe, a detail that differed from the other victims who were struck with the blunt pole of the weapon. The initial blow to Josiah was catastrophic, killing him instantly, though the killer struck him countless times more. Sarah was next. She too was bludgeoned to death in her sleep. The killer then moved out of the master bedroom and ascended the narrow, steep staircase to the 2nd floor. The layout of the upstairs consisted of 2 rooms. In one room slept the 4 Moore children. In the other, the 2 Stillinger girls. The killer moved from bed to bed, child to child. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were all murdered in their beds. The brutality was absolute. There was no hesitation, no mercy. The killer then turned to the guest room where Lena and Ina slept. There is evidence to suggest that Lena Stillinger may have been the only one to wake up. Her body was found positioned slightly down in the bed, and there was a defensive mark on her arm, suggesting she may have tried to block a blow or realized someone was there in the final second of her life. However, the end result was the same. 8 people, 2 adults and 6 children, were dead. But the killer did not leave immediately. What happened after the murders adds a layer of psychological horror that has baffled investigators for over a century. The killer went through the house and covered the mirrors and the glass of the entry doors with clothing and skirts taken from the dressers. A piece of bacon, weighing about 2 pounds, was taken from the icebox and placed on the floor of the downstairs bedroom near the axe. A smaller piece of bacon was found in the icebox. A plate of food was found on the dining room table, untouched. The killer also took the time to lock the doors from the inside and exit, likely through a window or by locking the door with a key and taking the keys with them, as the house was found secured the next morning. The sun rose on Monday, June 10, 1912, bringing light to a house of death. The discovery began with a neighbor, Mary Peckham. Mary was an early riser, and by 7:30 in the morning, she noticed that the Moore house was strangely quiet. Josiah was not out doing his morning chores. Sarah was not in the kitchen. The children were not playing in the yard. Most concerning of all, the chickens had not been fed. Mary knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She tried the knob, but it was locked. A sense of dread, that peculiar intuition that something is wrong, washed over her. She called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived quickly. He knocked, shouted, and circled the house. Nothing. The silence was deafening. He produced a set of keys and tried to unlock the door, but the key ring would not turn. The door was locked from the inside with a key still in the hole, or so it seemed. Finally, Ross and Mary Peckham managed to open the door, or perhaps peered through a window dark enough to require entry. Ross went inside while Mary waited on the porch. He went to the bedroom downstairs. He came out seconds later, his face pale, his voice trembling. He told Mary to call the marshal immediately. He had seen blood. City Marshal Hank Horton arrived shortly after. He entered the house and conducted a walkthrough that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He came out into the daylight and spoke the words that would shatter Villisca forever. He said there was somebody murdered in every bed. As the news spread, the reaction of the town was a mixture of panic and morbid curiosity. And here begins one of the greatest tragedies of the investigation. In 1912, crime scene preservation was a virtually non-existent concept, especially in rural Iowa. As the word went out, hundreds of people flocked to the house. They didn't just stand outside, they went inside. Neighbors, townspeople, and strangers walked through the rooms, staring at the bodies, touching the furniture, and trampling over potential evidence. One witness later claimed that a piece of Josiah's skull was even taken as a souvenir. By the time the authorities could establish a proper cordon, the crime scene had been hopelessly contaminated. Fingerprints, footprints, and the positioning of small objects were lost in the stampede of the curious. The National Guard eventually arrived to restore order, but the damage was done. The initial investigation was chaotic. Bloodhounds were brought in, but they were confused by the hundreds of scents now lingering in the house and yard. They ran in circles, eventually leading nowhere. The coroner, Dr. Lindquist, conducted autopsies that confirmed the time of death to be shortly after midnight. The axe, found in the guest room leaning against the wall, was confirmed as the murder weapon. It was covered in blood and hair. The town of Villisca locked its doors. People slept with shotguns by their beds. The suspicion turned inward. Who could have done this? Was it a drifter, a madman, or was it someone they knew? The list of suspects in the Villisca Axe Murders is long, complex, and filled with contradictions. To understand why this case remains unsolved, we must examine the primary suspects in detail. The first and most controversial suspect was Frank F. Jones. Frank Jones was a powerful man in Villisca. He was a state senator and a successful businessman who owned a farm implement store. Josiah Moore had worked for Jones for many years before leaving to open his own rival business. Moore was not only successful, he was taking business away from Jones. The rivalry was bitter and personal. There were rumors, never substantiated but widely whispered, that Josiah Moore had been having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. The theory was that Frank Jones, unable to do the deed himself, had hired a hitman. This theory gained traction because of the sheer animosity between the men. However, Jones was a prominent figure, and accusing him was dangerous. No hard evidence ever linked Jones directly to the crime, but the shadow of suspicion hung over him and his family for decades. The idea that a pillar of the community could orchestrate the slaughter of children was too terrifying for some to accept, and yet too plausible for others to ignore. This leads us to the second major suspect, the alleged hitman, William Blackie Mansfield. Blackie Mansfield was a known criminal with a history of violence. The investigation into Mansfield was driven by a private detective named James Newton Wilkerson, who became obsessed with proving the Frank Jones connection. Wilkerson believed that Jones hired Mansfield to kill Moore. The evidence against Mansfield was circumstantial but compelling to some. It was discovered that Mansfield had family in the area. Furthermore, a similar set of axe murders had occurred in Blue Island, Illinois, and Piola, Kansas, around the same time. The modus operandi was strikingly similar. The use of an axe, the covering of mirrors, and the lack of forced entry. Mansfield was arrested and brought to Villisca. However, it turned out that Mansfield had a strong alibi. Payroll records showed he was working in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. A grand jury refused to indict him, and he was released. But to this day, many believe the payroll records could have been forged, or that he could have traveled and returned in time. The third, and perhaps most bizarre suspect, was Reverend George Kelly. Reverend Kelly was a traveling preacher who had been at the Children's Day service that very night. He was a small man, described as odd and eccentric. In the days following the murders, Kelly displayed a fascination with the crime that bordered on obsession. He posed as a detective, he talked to everyone about the details, and he even sent a bloody shirt to a laundry, claiming the blood was from a turkey he had slaughtered, though no one recalled him slaughtering a turkey. Kelly left town the morning after the murders on an early train. During the journey, he allegedly told fellow passengers that there had been a terrible crime in Villisca, even before the bodies had been officially discovered. This detail, if true, was damning. Years later, Kelly was arrested. Under intense interrogation, which many today would classify as coercive, he confessed. He claimed that God had whispered to him, telling him to slay the wicked. He said he was guided by a voice that told him to suffer the little children to come unto him. Kelly went to trial. The first trial resulted in a hung jury. The town was divided. Some saw him as a lunatic who had clearly committed the crime. Others saw a mentally unstable man being railroaded by investigators desperate to close the case. A second trial was held, and this time, Reverend Kelly was acquitted. The confession was thrown out as coerced, and the lack of physical evidence made a conviction impossible. Kelly ended up in a mental institution, but legally, he was innocent of the Villisca murders. There is a fourth theory that has gained significant weight in modern times, championed by crime historians like Bill James. This is the theory of a serial killer who traveled by train. The Villisca murders were not an isolated incident. Across the Midwest, from 1911 to 1912, there was a string of family annihilations involving axes. The crimes occurred in Colorado, Kansas, Illinois, and Iowa. In almost every case, the killer struck at night, used a weapon found at the scene, covered the victims' faces, and covered the windows or mirrors. The proximity of the crime scenes to railroad tracks is the key connector. The suspect in this theory is often identified as a man named Henry Lee Moore, or simply referred to as the man from the train. The profile fits a transient individual, someone who could drift into a town, blend in, commit an atrocity, and hop a freight train out before the bodies were even cold. This theory explains the lack of local motive and the extreme brutality. It suggests that the Moore family and the Stillinger girls were simply victims of opportunity, chosen at random by a roving predator. Within the house itself, the forensic details that did survive provide chilling insights. The axe had been wiped clean of most blood, but still retained enough to show it was the weapon. The gouge marks on the ceiling in the children's room indicated the killer had swung the axe with such frenzy that the back swing chipped the plaster. The chimney had been removed from the kerosene lamp found in the bedroom, suggesting the killer had lit the wick but kept the flame extremely low to avoid casting light. Moving through the house in a dim, flickering glow. The bacon on the floor remains an enigma. Was it a perverse signature? Was the killer hungry and then interrupted? Or was it, as some suggest, used to grease the hardware of the lamp? We must also look at the legal and social aftermath. The failure to convict anyone tore Villisca apart. The accusations against Frank Jones split the town into factions. Neighbors stopped speaking to neighbors. The Moore family relatives felt abandoned by the justice system. The Stillingers, who had sent their daughters to church only to have them returned in coffins, were broken by grief. The house on East 2nd Street remained a dark scar on the neighborhood. For years, it sat empty. Renters would come and go, often leaving quickly, claiming the house felt wrong. The reputation of the house as being haunted began almost immediately. People reported seeing lights moving in the windows when no one was there. They heard the sounds of children crying. They felt cold spots and the sensation of being watched. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House is a preserved historical site and a destination for paranormal investigators. It has been restored to look exactly as it did in 1912. The furniture is period appropriate. The layout is unchanged. Visitors can walk through the kitchen where the family ate their last meal, stand in the parlor, and ascend the stairs to the bedrooms. The atmosphere is undeniably heavy. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the weight of the tragedy that occurred there is palpable. Forensic science has advanced light years since 1912. We now have DNA profiling, luminol, advanced fingerprinting, and behavioral profiling. But in 1912, they had none of this. They relied on bloodhounds, hearsay, and basic observation. If the crime happened today, it is almost certain that forensic evidence would have been found. The killer would have left DNA on the axe handle, on the bacon, on the door locks. But that evidence is long gone, scrubbed away by well-meaning neighbors and the passage of time. The conspiracy theories continue to swirl. Was it a local conspiracy involving the town's elite? Was it a wandering psychopath? Was it the fiery preacher? The truth is likely buried in a grave, known only to the killer and the victims. The lack of resolution is what keeps the case alive. It denies us the closure we crave. We want to know the why. We want to put a face to the monster. But Villisca denies us that satisfaction. The legacy of the Villisca Axe Murders is a reminder of vulnerability. It shattered the illusion of safety in rural America. It showed that evil does not need a reason, and it does not respect the sanctity of a home or the innocence of a child. The 8 victims, Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, Lena, and Ina, were real people with futures that were stolen. As we look back on this case, we are left with the image of that small white house, sitting in the silence of the Iowa plains. We are left with the mystery of the locked doors and the covered mirrors. We are left with the question that has echoed for over a century. Who walked through the darkness that night, and why? Thank you for joining DCF Investigations for this deep dive into one of America's most disturbing cold cases. The story of Villisca is a testament to the enduring nature of unsolved mysteries. If you have your own theory about who held the axe that night, or if you believe the man from the train was responsible. We want to hear your detailed thoughts in the comments below. Do you think modern forensics could ever solve a case this old if exhumations were performed? Stay vigilant, stay curious, and we will see you in the next investigation.